Welcome.
Four-player arcade games were something of a rarity in the early 1980s. In 1980, Atari had produced Warlords in both a two-player upright cabinet and also a four-player simultaneous sit-down cocktail-style machine. The first four-player arcade smash hit would come in 1985 thanks to Atari's release of Gauntlet. What's the backstory on this game and why were there rumblings of a lawsuit? So grab the treasure but don't shoot the food because Warrior needs food badly. This is the history of Gauntlet. The year is 1984 and Atari designer Ed Logg has an idea for a new game but hasn't quite figured out how to implement it. Mr. Logg had been involved in game design for some time, helping co-create such arcade classics as Asteroids, and Centipede. With this idea, however, he was stumped. He had noticed his son's interest in the paper-based game Dungeons & Dragons, and thought this would be a great concept for an arcade game but didn't know how to make it work. Around this time, Mr. Logg had stumbled across a game for the Atari 8-bit computer line called Dandy. Dandy was a four-player simultaneous game created by John Palovich, which utilized a top-down 2D viewpoint. You had to collect food, potions, and treasures, all the while defeating the onslaught of enemies. Another cool feature of this game was the ability to create your own levels. Does any of this sound just a tad bit familiar? Dandy was available through Atari's Program Exchange, which sold software through mail order and was a huge success. Mr. Logg had wanted to call the game Dungeons, but Atari's lawyers felt it was too similar to Dungeons & Dragons. Before the game's release, a couple of characters had their names changed. Warrior was originally called Hulk, and Valkyrie was called Amazon. Gauntlet was released in 1985 by Atari, and from the get-go it was a massive success. This is a simultaneous four-player arcade game which sees you take on the role of various Dungeons & Dragons inspired characters while you search for treasure, potions, and the mandatory food items, all while killing every enemy in sight. The gameplay is non-linear, meaning there are multiple ways to play through and exit a level. If you have ever played with a group of four people, sometimes the arguments would start even before the game did, all because each joystick was assigned to a certain character who each had different attributes. Thyra, the Valkyrie, has the strongest armor. Thor, the Warrior, is good at hand-to-hand combat. Questor is the fastest character, and Merlin has the most powerful magic attacks. The goal of the game is just to survive as long as possible while exploring the deepest, darkest dungeons. As I mentioned, there are things you have to collect if you want to progress very far into the game. Number 1 is food, thanks to a crafty, also just a little bit shady, feature that sees your health deplete roughly 1 point per second, so food is an absolute must. Your health will also deplete if you come in contact with the various enemies. The treasures will increase your points, while the potions offer improved character abilities such as extra shot power or speed. The potions can also be used as sort of a smart bomb, which will kill all the enemies on screen. You can also use the potion at any time by pressing the magic button, but they can only be used once. In addition to replenishing your energy via food, you can also just insert more credits. Thanks to its unique buy-in feature, if a player happens to drop out, someone else can buy in and take their place. The goal of each level is to find the exit, which ultimately leads to the next dungeon. There are various monster generators that will spawn demons, ghosts, grunts, lobbers, sorcerers, thieves, and the most powerful baddie in the game, the great big bad, Death himself. You can only kill Death with potions, so be careful. It's essential to destroy the generators to stop the flood of monsters. If you're in a tight spot, you can also use a teleporter, which are spread throughout the levels, and will transport you to the next nearest one, hopefully giving you a few seconds of breathing room. As I mentioned, you can play either cooperatively or competitively. If you play as a team and work your way through each level, you'll progress further. Sometimes though, you'll play with a bad apple who takes everything for themselves despite what the dungeon master is saying. Hidden throughout the game are treasure rooms in which you have to pick up different types of gold and silver and make it to the exit before time runs out. One of the most memorable aspects is the dungeon master talking all throughout the game. There had been synthesized voice in previous arcade games, but nowhere near the sheer amount found in this one. There are 212 unique sounds, including the voices found in this game. The dungeon master will give you instructions as well as telling you which person needs food or is about to die. There are 100 unique levels in the game, but the first 7 levels are always the same. Starting with level 8, they are randomized. If you manage to make it past level 100, the existing mazes are rotated or flipped. Due to this, there is no ending to the game. When the game was released, it was a monster success, and Atari sold over 7,500 cabinets in the US alone and another 2,500 overseas. Due to the sheer size of the actual arcade cabinet, Atari would go on to produce a 2-player version. There were a number of home conversions available, but I will talk about them at the end of the video. Gauntlet II was released in 1986 and featured some significant improvements over the original. While the gameplay remained essentially the same, the first thing you'll notice is that now players can choose the same character, only differentiated by the color. The Dungeon Master will now call out Blue Elf, Red Wizard, etc. One new maneuver which was much appreciated is the ability to ricochet shots off walls, also known as reflective shots, which really come in handy when you're trapped. At certain times, the maps may tilt 90 degrees, throwing off the players even more. The game also added acid puddles and a giant dragon which takes plenty of hits to kill. If you thought things were competitive in the first game, then check out the new edition of the It enemy. Once It comes into contact with the player, all of the enemies are drawn toward him until he touches another player and they essentially become It. If you're feeling just a little bit brave and just a little bit bold, you can lead the horde of monsters away from your teammates, but it's most certainly suicide. If you don't feel like being the hero and just want to get away as quick as possible, you can always touch one of your teammates and head for the hills. It's a fun little play mechanic that works really well. New elements for levels were added, such as invisible walls, magic walls which turn into enemies when touched, and stun tiles, among others. There was a competition that coincided with the release of Gauntlet II. Players had to follow the instructions given throughout the game for clues that would lead them to the secret rooms. After successfully completing all these tasks, you are asked to enter your name and a 6-digit code was given. The first 500 contestants successfully did this received a free Gauntlet II t-shirt and a chance to win a $5,000 savings bond. After the completion of Gauntlet II, designer Ed Logg wanted to take the third game into the third dimension. But, believe it or not, Atari was not interested in doing a third arcade game. Mr. Logg ended up utilizing what he was going to use for Gauntlet III and created a whole new arcade game called Zybots. In 1990, Gauntlet the Third Encounter was released for the Atari Lynx. This is a brand new entry into the Gauntlet series, but actually started out life as Time Quest and Treasure Chest by Epic Software. Due to the similarity of the game to Gauntlet, they decided to rebrand the game to take advantage of the massive IP. This version at least has somewhat of a story, with you and your band of cohorts delving into the dungeons to retrieve the star gem. This time around, you have 8 different classes to choose from, including the Valkyrie and the Wizard from the original series, along with a punk rocker, android, gunfighter, samurai, pirate, and a nerd who looks suspiciously similar to Chip from the Atari Lynx game Chip's Challenge. Now, just between you and me, nothing brings me into the whole Gauntlet style of gameplay than getting to play as a punk rocker. There are only 40 levels this time around, but you can link 4 systems together for multiplayer madness. The gameplay is very similar to previous entries, with you having to grab food, potions, and treasures. The only problem I found with the game was that your projectiles moved just a bit too slow, making it even harder to blast away the onslaught of enemies. In 1991, US Gold released Gauntlet III, the final quest for the home computer market. Although versions were released for the Commodore 64 and Spectrum among others, the Amiga version was the best of the bunch, so that's what we're looking at today. The first thing you notice is that it no longer uses a top-down 2D perspective, but an isometric viewpoint instead. The 4 original heroes from the first 2 arcade games make their return, along with a lizard man, an ice man, a merman, and a man made of rock. Rather than fight your way to the end of each stage as quickly as possible, you have to complete certain tasks before you can proceed to the next dungeon. Due to the semi-3D aspect of all the characters, you'll never encounter more than 7 or 8 enemies on screen at once, a far cry from the original. This really brings down the tension factor in the game. The graphics look great and the music is phenomenal, but the game just doesn't have that Gauntlet feel to it. In my opinion, Gauntlet should always be played from a top-down 2D perspective as found in the originals. Gauntlet IV was released for the Sega Genesis by Tengen in 1993. This was developed by a group of friends who would go on to form M2. It started out life as a fan-made arcade conversion for the X68000, but Tengen picked up the game and it formed the basis for the sequel. There are a number of new features, including a quest mode, an arcade mode which is basically a port of the arcade game, battle mode, deathmatch mode, and more. If you have Sega's multi-tap adapter, you can also have 4 people playing at once, just like the original. The graphics and sounds are really well done, although the voice quality is not quite as clear due to the limitations of the Sega hardware. Back in the day, this was the best home port available and was very close to the arcade game. In 1998, a full 12 years after its last arcade outing, Gauntlet Legends was released in the arcades. The game uses an isometric 3D viewpoint and the graphics look fantastic. 4-player simultaneous action makes a return, but there are quite a few new features as well. Upon starting up the game, it asks you to enter your name and password, which allows saving, something that was quite revolutionary at the time. The 4 original characters return, but this time around you have the ability to upgrade your attributes in between each level. The attributes that can be upgraded are armor, magic, strength, and speed. Each character also has a bonus character you can access once you reach level 10. Instead of the standard 2 buttons found in almost every other version of the game, this one grants you 3 with a standard fire button, a magic button, and a turbo button which makes your character run faster. Pressing different combinations of buttons will do different things, such as fire and turbo at the same time will do a special magic attack. Fire and magic at the same time will allow you to throw potions over walls and other barricades, etc. There are lots of new items to collect, including the standard food, keys, silver and gold, among others. There are various other power-ups to pick up as well, such as an hourglass which stops everything on the screen, three-way shot, enemy shrinker, etc. So how does it play? It plays pretty good. There is definitely nothing wrong with the graphics or the sounds or the controls. It is reminiscent of Gauntlet, but it just doesn't quite have that same feeling as the top-down overhead 2D original. It was still fun to play though, especially when you had 3 other people playing alongside you. The game was also released for the PS1, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast.
Use magic to kill death. Yellow warrior, insert coins to continue.
Gauntlet Dark Legacy was released in the arcades in 2000. This was more of an expansion pack to Gauntlet Legends, but with more levels and 4 new character classes including Sorceress, Knight, Dwarf, and Jester. The attacks of your characters have also been altered, with you now being able to perform a slow strong attack or a weaker quick attack. This was different from the previous game in which you only had one type. You can now perform various combos by alternating between weak and strong attacks, which ultimately will take out more enemies. You can still upgrade your attributes in between levels, and the shop where you purchase items has a wider variety to choose from. This game also introduces blocking, charging, and strafing to your character's arsenal. The name and password system also makes its return. There are lots of secret characters to unlock either by a code or by completing certain tasks in the game. It's a pretty big improvement over the original, but again, it feels more like an expansion or upgrade than a full-fledged game. The game was also released for the PS2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, and GameCube.
Yellow warrior has lightning amulet.
In 2005, Gauntlet 7 Sorrows was released for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Xbox 360. This is somewhat of a reboot of the franchise, with it going back to its roots. The 4 original characters are selectable, but a lot of the customizable elements of the previous 2 games were removed. This is much more in line with the original arcade game. This is essentially a hack and slash affair with a few puzzles thrown throughout. You do have a few combos you can perform which will do greater damage to your surrounding enemies. You have to contend with 6 bosses this time around, and they take a lot of hits to defeat. Defeating enemies will give you experience points so you can increase your stats and purchase new moves. You can play in single, co-op, and for the first time, online simultaneous 4-player action. I used to play this back in the day and had a lot of fun with it. The graphics look great and the sound is fantastic, with bits and pieces of the original arcade audio included, which gives me the warm fuzzies whenever I play it. It's got that fast and frantic gameplay that Gauntlet should have. The original Gauntlet arcade game was included on Midway's Arcade Treasures, which was released in 2014. Also in 2014, the game was officially rebooted and simply titled Gauntlet for Steam and eventually the PS4. The game was given a massive update in 2015 and the name was changed to Gauntlet Slayer Edition. The graphics use a more semi-3D overhead perspective, but in my opinion, the camera is zoomed way too far out, making things just a bit too difficult to see. A lot of what made the original so appealing makes its return with hidden rooms, destroying generators, killing monsters, etc. There are multiple difficulties, so even the babies in the bunch should be able to enjoy it. There is also online support for up to 4 players. You can upgrade your characters to a point by buying new weapons, spells, and improving your stats. The graphics and sounds are pretty good, especially considering the game only costs $20. Tiger Electronics even made a handheld version of the game. Gauntlet was available on Xbox Live in 2005. It featured 4-player simultaneous play over Xbox Live. And since it was running under emulation, it was basically the arcade game at home. The license of the game ran out in 2010, so it's no longer available. I just wanted to make a quick mention that the original author of Dandy, John Palovich, had contacted Atari about the similarities between his game and Gauntlet, and wanted his name added to the credits of the game. Atari felt that it would be too costly to produce new boards with his name added, so instead they gave him a full Gauntlet cabinet as well as credit in future games.
Gauntlet, the new fantasy adventure from Atari Games. The most fun a quarter can buy.
Alright, now on with the conversions. Now I'm not going to cover every single version that came out, because there are a ton, not including Gauntlet II and Gauntlet III conversions. This game was released by US Gold back in 1987, and some of these turned out pretty well, but due to the technology involved, sacrifices had to be made. The first one we are taking a look at is the Spectrum version. First things first, the color scheme is downright hideous. The sprites are detailed with plenty of on-screen enemies with very little slowdown. There is essentially no in-game music and only the occasional grunts and toots. There is a nice little jingle that plays on the title screen and also in between each level. The game controls pretty well, and at least it's fast. But then again, so was my prom night. Up next is the Atari XL version, and after having my eyeballs melted by the colors of the Spectrum version, this is a nice soothing experience. At least until you actually start playing it. Not only do you get stiff controls, but the speed of the game is about 50% of the arcade original with slow, herky-jerky action. The speed of your projectiles also seems to be just a bit off. The graphics look nice, but the animation and scrolling is just way too choppy. There are also nowhere near the amount of enemies on screen as found in the arcade game, or even the Spectrum version for that matter. If you have any of your eyeballs left over, be prepared to have them completely melted away after playing the MSX version. Now, I didn't think it was possible for the colors to look any worse than the Spectrum, but the trusty and perhaps rusty MSX computer pulls it off. This is basically a port of the Spectrum, only not quite as polished. The gameplay is just about the same, although just a bit slower. Just when I think it couldn't get any worse, the bowels of gaming history keep slapping me in the face. The Apple II version not only gave me a headache while looking at the game, but I cannot operate any motorized vehicles for at least a week. The colors are absolutely atrocious and the speed is laughable. How the company could release a game in this state is beyond me, unless it was just a quick cash grab. And that was probably what happened here. If the name of your game is pain, then this is the game for you. The Amstrad version is really well done, especially considering the limitations of the machine. The sprites are a bit tiny, but they are detailed and are animated quite nicely. The colors are nice and vibrant, and thankfully this isn't just another Spectrum port. The only music available is the title screen tune, as well as music in between each level, but it sounds pretty good. Speed-wise, it's a bit clunky. While it runs at about 75% of the arcade original, everything is a bit choppy. Overall though, it's a pretty good attempt. The Commodore 64 version is up next, and it's a very good conversion for the 8-bit platform. The scrolling is nice and smooth along with the animation. There are plenty of monsters on screen to kill with hardly any slowdown in sight. The speed of the game is very close to the arcade original, and the controls are nice and tight and feel just like Gauntlet. The only thing that lets it down is that the sprites are not as detailed as in the Amstrad version, although this one tends to play better in my opinion. The sound effects and music are very well done thanks to the lovely Commodore 64 SID chip. Moving on up, just like George and Louise, let's take a look at some of the 16-bit computer conversions. To cleanse the palate of the horrible Apple II version, let's try the Apple II GS, which is comparable to an Amiga spec-wise, except in this case. Just by taking a look at the GS conversion of Raston, we know the system should be more than capable of handling Gauntlet, so I don't know what happened. This looks like a better colored version of the Commodore 64, but running at a lower frame rate. The graphics have a squashed look to them and the animation is very choppy. I cannot comment on the sound as I couldn't get it to run properly under emulation. The speed of the game is about 50 to 60% of the arcade original. And now for something just a little bit different, let's take a look at the original Macintosh version. I do believe this is the first original Macintosh game I've covered on the channel. While there is obviously no color, there is a lot of detail in the sprites. There is something charming about black and white pixel art, especially done on the Macintosh. Speed-wise, it's more or less consistent with the arcade original with hints of slowdown here and there. The sound effects and music are adequate with a few digitized grunts and groans thrown in. It controls fairly well, but to be honest, there are much better versions to play. Gauntlet was also released for MS-DOS, but the machines at the time just couldn't handle the game. For starters, your character appears to have been lying in the sun for about 9 days because he is a lot smaller than in the arcade game. The animation is horrible with lots of missing frames. The scrolling is too choppy, but at least the speed of the game is adequate. The collision detection is something else entirely with plenty of shots going right through the monsters. The sound effects are typical internal PC speaker, which sounds like my grandma gargling mouthwash. Next up is the Atari ST version, but it's only average at best. The sprites are detailed and very colorful, but the scrolling is just too choppy. The animation is fast with plenty of enemies on screen at once. The sound effects and music are not very good, with none of the digitized speech carried over from the arcade game. The gameplay feels nice and tight, it's just too bad the scrolling is so choppy. The first thing you notice about the Sega Master System version is the immense speed of the game. I would never have pegged the elf as a crackhead, but that would be the only thing that would explain how fast he is. Out of all the versions I've played, this one by far has the best speed. Gameplay wise, we are treated to 2 buttons this time around, so it feels much more like the arcade original. The sound effects and music are pretty good, although none of the digitized voices are present. Overall though, this is one of the best home conversions on the 8-bit platforms. Speaking of the 8-bits, let's take a look at the NES version. If you are familiar at all with the arcade game, you'll notice certain things just aren't right. The title screen has been redesigned. The title screen music is brand new as well. The layout of the mazes are totally different from the arcade game. The graphics are chunky and have a horrible color palette. There is decent music while you play, which in all fairness isn't that bad. The bright spot is definitely the controls, which feels nice and tight the way Gauntlet should. Gauntlet was another phenomenon from the masters at Atari Games. It created the dungeon crawl genre whose roots can still be felt in games today. I have very fond memories of blasting away all the monsters with 3 other friends and exploring all the various dungeons. It's best to play this with a group of friends, but if you don't have any, you can always play with yourself. If you liked this video or any of my content on the channel, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below whether you liked or disliked it. Also, if you'd like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thanks for watching.